March 9, 2009. 180 nautical miles south of Hainan Island, in waters the People's Liberation Army Navy had declared their exclusive undersea domain, Chinese sonar operators tracking what they believed was empty ocean suddenly froze at their monitors. USNS Impeccable, an unarmed American ocean surveillance vessel, sat motionless on the surface, while her crew operated something the Chinese Naval Command had assured Beijing would be impossible to deploy undetected in their backyard. Suspended 240 meters beneath Impeccable's hull, a kilometer-long towed array of hydrophones listened in absolute silence to every acoustic signature emanating from the Yulin Naval Base submarine pens just beyond the horizon. 5 Chinese vessels converged on Impeccable in international waters, their crews attempting to sever the towed array with grappling hooks, while PLA Navy headquarters processed an uncomfortable realization. If an unarmed surveillance ship could operate with impunity in waters China had militarized with artificial islands, radar networks, and subsurface sensor grids, what had America's Virginia-class nuclear attack submarines been doing in these same depths for the past decade? Within 72 hours of the Impeccable incident, classified briefings circulated through the Central Military Commission revealing an intelligence failure of historic proportions. U.S. Navy submarines had been mapping, recording, and analyzing every chokepoint, thermal layer, and acoustic corridor in the South China Sea since the Los Angeles-class boats first penetrated these waters during the Cold War, and China's vaunted underwater surveillance network had detected precisely none of them. The confidence radiating from Beijing in the spring of 2009 stemmed from a strategic assumption that had shaped PLA Navy doctrine for 15 years. Chinese admirals reviewing sonar deployment plans for the Spratly and Paracel Islands operated under the belief that modern passive sonar technology combined with chokepoint geography would create an impenetrable detection grid. Senior Captain Zhang Hongming, writing in a restricted circulation PLA Navy journal obtained by U.S. Naval Intelligence, articulated this confidence with precision. The shallow bathymetry and acoustic propagation characteristics of the near seas create ideal conditions for comprehensive subsurface monitoring, Zhang wrote in a 2007 assessment that would be declassified after his defection in 2012. Foreign submarines attempting transit through the first island chain face detection probabilities exceeding 70% under optimal conditions, rising to 90% during coordinated search operations. The technical annexes accompanying Zhang's report detailed deployment plans for seabed-mounted hydrophone arrays at depths approaching 3,000 meters in the Luzon Strait, complemented by mobile sonar buoys communicating via encrypted satellite uplinks to processing centers on Woody Island and the newly constructed facilities at Fiery Cross Reef. Chinese defense scientists had calculated that this network, once operational, would reduce any submarine's survival probability to a mere 5% if detected during the critical transit phase between deep Pacific waters and the shallow South China Sea basin. The mathematics appeared irrefutable, the physics unambiguous. Yet every calculation rested on a single unexamined premise that American submarine designers had been systematically invalidating since 1975. Chinese sonar engineers assumed they would hear U.S. submarines before those submarines completed their mission. That assumption contained a fatal flaw that would take another decade to expose fully. The Virginia-class fast attack submarine USS Hawaii, commissioned in 2007 as SSN 776, represented the culmination of 5 decades of American investment in what the Naval Sea Systems Command termed acoustic superiority through signature reduction. Unlike earlier Los Angeles-class boats that relied primarily on anechoic hull coatings to absorb enemy sonar pulses, Virginia-class submarines integrated acoustic stealth into every system from conception. The S-9G nuclear reactor operated with natural circulation at tactical speeds, eliminating the pump noise that had betrayed previous generations of nuclear boats. Machinery mounted on isolation rafts reduced structure-borne vibration transmission to the hull by factors exceeding 100 compared to Cold War-era designs. The 7-bladed screw, precisely machined to tolerances measured in microns, and designed using computational fluid dynamics unavailable to Soviet engineers, produced thrust without the cavitation bubbles that had long been the acoustic signature most easily detected by passive sonar. When USS Hawaii conducted acoustic trials in the tongue of the ocean off Andros Island in October 2006, Calibrated hydrophones positioned at known ranges recorded sound pressure levels of 95 decibels at tactical speed. To comprehend the tactical implications of this number requires understanding that decibel scales are logarithmic, not linear. The ambient noise level of the ocean from wave action, marine life, and thermal activity typically registers between 80 and 90 decibels depending on sea state and location. A Virginia-class submarine operating at 95 decibels generates only 3 times more acoustic energy than the background ocean noise, while China's most advanced indigenous submarine, the Type 93 Shang class, produced acoustic signatures consistently measured at 115 decibels or greater. That 20 decibel difference translated to 100 times more detectable acoustic energy radiating from Chinese hulls compared to American boats operating in the same waters. The consequences of this acoustic advantage became operationally decisive when combined with the second element of American undersea dominance that Chinese planners had catastrophically underestimated. The surveillance towed array sensor system, first deployed operationally in 1980 aboard modified surveillance vessels, represented the offensive application of the same passive sonar technology that had given NATO decisive advantage over Soviet submarines throughout the Cold War. SURTASS arrays consisted of hydrophone elements distributed along cables exceeding 300 meters in length, towed at depths where acoustic propagation characteristics remained optimal regardless of surface conditions. The twin-line TL-29A array deployed from ocean surveillance ships like USNS Impeccable could detect diesel-electric submarines operating on battery power at ranges exceeding 100 nautical miles under favorable propagation conditions, and nuclear submarines at even greater distances. The low-frequency active variant, SURTASS-LFA, added active sonar transmission capability in the 100 to 500 Hz band, frequencies specifically chosen because they propagate with minimal attenuation across hundreds of kilometers of ocean. When USNS Impeccable began SURTASS LFA trials in the Philippine Sea during spring 2004, the system demonstrated detection capabilities that Office of Naval Intelligence analysts described in a restricted assessment as sufficient to localize diesel submarines conducting snorkel operations at ranges approaching 200 kilometers, providing targeting data of sufficient quality for long-range anti-submarine weapons employment. The implications for Chinese submarine operations were devastating. Every Type 39 Song-class diesel boat departing Yulin or Zhao Pingdao naval bases radiated acoustic signatures across frequency ranges that SURTASS arrays detected with signal-to-noise ratios permitting tracking for the entire duration of their patrol. If you appreciate discovering the technological asymmetries that determined undersea dominance during the first decades of this century, consider subscribing to Classified Warfare for future revelations about the silent battles that shaped naval strategy across 3 oceans. The moment Chinese naval intelligence began to grasp the scale of their acoustic disadvantage came not from their own sensor networks, but from a source they had never anticipated would provide such devastating confirmation. In September 2006, the USS Kitty Hawk carrier strike group conducting routine operations approximately 400 kilometers south of Okinawa received an unpleasant surprise when a Chinese Type 39 Song-class submarine surfaced within torpedo range of the carrier, having apparently penetrated multiple layers of anti-submarine defenses undetected. Chinese media celebrated the incident as proof of PLA Navy capabilities to threaten American carrier operations in the Western Pacific. What those reports never mentioned, because the information remained classified within restricted PLA Navy channels until its later compromise, was that the submarine commander who executed that intercept had been tracked continuously by SURTASS-equipped USS John S. McCain operating 80 kilometers distant from the moment the Song-class boat departed its base in Ningbo 3 days earlier. The decision to allow the Chinese submarine to reach firing position on Kitty Hawk was deliberate, approved at Pacific Fleet commander level, designed to provide the Song-class crew with false confidence while USS Hawaii, operating undetected 1,000 meters below the thermocline, recorded every acoustic signature the Chinese boat produced during its approach, sprint, and withdrawal. Those recordings, processed at the Navy's Acoustic Research Detachment in Hawaii, provided updates to the acoustic reference library that every American submarine carried in its combat system, ensuring that future encounters with Song-class boats would result in detection at even greater ranges. The intelligence value of those recordings exceeded the tactical embarrassment of permitting a foreign submarine close approach to a carrier. Moreover, it confirmed what American submariners had believed since the first Virginia-class boat completed deepwater trials. Chinese submarines were louder by an order of magnitude sufficient to negate any tactical advantage their growing numbers might suggest. The third pillar of American undersea dominance in the South China Sea rested on capabilities that had no Chinese equivalent because they required technological sophistication and operational experience that could not be acquired through industrial espionage or accelerated development programs. Virginia-class submarines deployed with integrated sensor suites designated as the AN-BQQ-10 combat system, combining spherical and towed array passive sonars with active sonar, electronic surveillance measures, and data fusion capabilities that transformed raw acoustic data into actionable tactical pictures. The processing power embedded in the BQQ-10 permitted simultaneous tracking of multiple contacts while maintaining the submarine's own acoustic stealth, a capability that earlier combat systems could not achieve without increasing radiated noise through cooling systems and mechanical components. When combined with the photonics mast that replaced traditional periscopes, Virginia-class boats could collect electronic intelligence, communications intercepts, and visual imagery while exposing only a mast diameter of 15 centimeters above the surface for seconds at a time. These capabilities permitted intelligence collection missions that earlier submarine classes could not execute without accepting detection risks that mission planners deemed unacceptable. USS Texas, operating in the Luzon Strait during May 2008, spent 14 consecutive days recording acoustic signatures from every Chinese naval vessel transiting between the South China Sea and the Philippine Sea, cataloging the unique tonals produced by individual ships' propulsion systems, auxiliary machinery, and even ventilation systems. That acoustic library enabled automated classification of Chinese surface combatants from passive sonar data alone, eliminating the need for visual identification that might compromise a submarine's stealth. Yet the technological superiority embodied in Virginia-class submarines would have provided only tactical advantage without the institutional knowledge and operational experience that the U.S. Navy had been accumulating since submarines first became viable military platforms. American submariners had been mapping the acoustic environment of the South China Sea since the 1960s, when diesel boats operating from Subic Bay collected bathymetric data and sound velocity profiles that revealed the complex acoustic propagation paths created by seamounts, thermoclines, and salinity gradients. By the time Chinese engineers began designing their underwater sensor network in the late 1990s, American submarines had already identified every acoustic shadow zone, every convergence zone, every bottom bounce corridor that could either enhance or degrade sonar performance. The Naval Oceanographic Office maintained databases containing sound velocity profiles, bottom composition analyses, and ambient noise characteristics for every operationally significant location in the South China Sea, data that submarine commanders downloaded before each patrol and that fire control systems incorporated into target motion analysis calculations. This knowledge, accumulated across 5 decades and representing thousands of submarine patrol days, constituted an asymmetric advantage that no amount of Chinese investment in hardware could replicate on compressed timelines. When USS Hawaii transited the Bashi Channel between Taiwan and the Philippines in January 2008, her commanding officer navigated using bathymetric charts that identified a previously unknown seamount rising to within 400 meters of the surface, a feature that created an acoustic shadow zone where even a moderately quiet submarine became effectively invisible to sonar arrays positioned beyond the seamount. Chinese naval charts, based on Soviet-era surveys and limited indigenous hydrographic work, did not contain data of comparable fidelity. The submarine that Chinese sonar operators could not detect was operating in waters American oceanographers had mapped with precision approaching 1-meter vertical resolution. The revelation that American submarines had been operating with impunity throughout waters China considered secure came not from a dramatic detection event, but from the cumulative weight of evidence that Chinese naval intelligence could no longer dismiss. Between 2005 and 2010, U.S. Pacific Fleet attack submarines conducted an average of 43 deterrent patrols annually in the Western Pacific, A sortie rate that Office of Naval Intelligence Assessments indicated included extensive operations within the South China Sea and approaches to Chinese naval bases. During this same period, Chinese ASW forces achieved precisely zero confirmed detections of American submarines outside carefully orchestrated exercises where U.S. Navy participants deliberately operated in ways that facilitated detection for training purposes. This absence of evidence became evidence of absence that Chinese naval analysts found increasingly difficult to rationalize through explanations involving luck, weather, or operational timing. A restricted PLA Navy study completed in 2011 and later obtained through intelligence channels addressed this detection deficit with unusual candor. Our subsurface surveillance architecture demonstrates significant capability against conventional submarine threats operating at typical patrol speeds and depths, the assessment acknowledged. However, against ultra-quiet nuclear submarines employing sound silencing technologies we do not fully understand, operating in acoustic conditions they have extensively mapped, our detection probability approaches statistical insignificance. The report calculated that even with optimal sensor placement and favorable acoustic propagation, Chinese sonar arrays would detect a Virginia-class submarine conducting a covert transit of the South China Sea approximately 7% of the time, insufficient to enable effective interdiction. The remaining 93% of potential encounters would result in the American submarine completing its mission undetected, collecting intelligence that would inform future operations while Chinese forces remained unaware of the penetration. The operational consequences of this acoustic asymmetry extended far beyond intelligence collection and submarine operations. Every Chinese naval vessel, every merchant ship, every surface combatant operating in waters where American submarines maintained persistent surveillance operated under the assumption that their communications, their acoustic signatures, their operational patterns were being recorded and analyzed. This reality transformed the South China Sea from a secure Chinese maritime bastion into contested space, where information dominance belonged entirely to the United States Navy. When Arleigh Burke-class destroyers conducted freedom of navigation operations within 12 nautical miles of Chinese-occupied features in the Spratly Islands beginning in 2015, those surface operations occurred with the knowledge that Virginia-class submarines were positioned to provide early warning of any Chinese attempt to interfere with the transit. The submarines remained undetected, their presence unknown to Chinese forces, yet their positioning fundamentally altered the tactical calculus in ways that prevented escalation. Chinese naval commanders understood, even if they could not explicitly confirm through sensor detections, that American submarines were present. That understanding imposed restraint because any attempt to forcibly terminate a freedom of navigation operation might trigger a submarine-launched response that Chinese surface forces would have no opportunity to counter before weapons impact. Deterrence operated most effectively when the deterring force remained invisible yet credible, a calculus that acoustic superiority had perfected. The final element that completed American undersea dominance in the South China Sea involved capabilities that remained classified at levels exceeding those protecting submarine acoustic characteristics themselves. Virginia-class Block III submarines, beginning with USS North Dakota commissioned in 2014, incorporated the Virginia Payload Module, a hull extension containing 4 large-diameter vertical launch tubes, each capable of carrying 7 Tomahawk cruise missiles. This modification increased each submarine's strike capacity from 12 to 40 Tomahawks, transforming attack submarines from primarily anti-submarine and intelligence platforms into capital ships capable of independent strike operations against land targets. A single Block III Virginia-class submarine operating undetected in the South China Sea could hold at risk every Chinese military installation on artificial islands throughout the Spratly chain, every radar site, every surface-to-air missile battery, every communications node that Chinese engineers had constructed to project power across the 9-dash line. The strike planning calculations were straightforward. Tomahawk Block IV missiles possessed a range exceeding 2,400 kilometers, flight profiles that included sea-skimming terminal approach phases, and GPS guidance accuracy measured in single-digit meters. A submarine positioned 200 nautical miles east of Mischief Reef could engage targets throughout the Spratly Islands in Hainan and on the Chinese mainland itself without maneuvering from its patrol station. The missiles would arrive without warning, because the submarine's acoustic signature remained below detection thresholds, and because Tomahawk sea-skimming profiles exploited radar horizons to delay detection until seconds before impact. Chinese air defense networks optimized to engage high-altitude aircraft and ballistic missiles possessed limited capability against subsonic cruise missiles arriving from unexpected azimuths at altitudes below 50 meters. Even a robust defense might intercept 70% of incoming Tomahawks under optimal conditions. That still meant 12 warheads reaching their targets from a single submarine salvo, sufficient to eliminate every above-surface structure on an artificial island and crater every runway. Chinese awareness of this vulnerability manifested in strategic decisions that revealed the constraining effect of American acoustic superiority, even as Chinese surface forces expanded and Beijing's rhetoric about sovereignty claims intensified. The PLA Navy's reluctance to conduct aggressive submarine patrols in areas where encounters with U.S. Navy vessels might occur, the carefully choreographed nature of Chinese submarine deployments that remained in areas where Chinese ASW forces maintained coverage, the absence of Chinese submarines from regions where American carrier strike groups operated all reflected institutional understanding that Chinese boats operating beyond friendly sensor coverage faced detection and tracking by American submarines that Chinese forces would never locate in return. This acoustic disparity created a form of undersea domain denial, where Chinese submarines remained effectively confined to waters adjacent to mainland China, while American submarines operated globally without comparable constraints. A 2016 assessment by 3 PLA Navy officers published in a Chinese military journal captured this frustration with remarkable clarity for a document originating from a military that typically projected confidence in public statements. The peacetime operations of Chinese submarines face extremely high vulnerability to U.S. Navy undersea surveillance systems, Senior Captain Zhang and his co-authors wrote. The probability that PRC submarines are discovered when leaving port is extremely high, and there exists a fairly high probability that PRC submarines will be detected and intercepted while operating in the near seas. This admission, published in a journal with restricted circulation but subsequently obtained by Western intelligence, represented an extraordinary acknowledgement of operational inadequacy. Chinese submarine force commanders understood that American sensors tracked their boats from the moment they cleared port facilities until they returned, that this persistent surveillance degraded every element of submarine operations from training to deterrence, and that no near-term technological solution would alter this disparity. The strategic implications of American acoustic dominance in the South China Sea extended beyond military operations into the broader geopolitical competition between Washington and Beijing. Chinese investments in artificial island construction, radar installations, and surface forces created an appearance of control over disputed waters that influenced regional perceptions and American policy debates about whether freedom of navigation could be sustained in the face of Chinese assertiveness. Yet beneath the surface, in the domain where submarines operated and acoustic signatures determined survival, American dominance remained absolute. This subsurface reality imposed constraints on Chinese options during crises that leadership in Beijing understood even when public statements projected confidence in their ability to defend sovereignty claims through force if necessary. The knowledge that American submarines could strike Chinese installations throughout the South China Sea with little warning, that those submarines were effectively undetectable by Chinese ASW forces, and that Chinese submarines faced tracking and potential engagement the moment they attempted to leave protected waters created a deterrent framework that operated independently of surface naval balance or relative air power capabilities. Crisis stability in the South China Sea rested on an acoustic asymmetry that favored the United States to a degree that would have seemed implausible to observers focusing exclusively on visible indicators of military power like carrier deployments or fighter aircraft capabilities. The Chinese response to this acoustic disadvantage, once leadership in Beijing fully absorbed the strategic implications, manifested in programs that betrayed both the sophistication of Chinese technological efforts and the fundamental difficulty of the challenge they confronted. The Great Underwater Wall Initiative, announced with limited detail in Chinese state media during 2016, proposed constructing a comprehensive undersea surveillance network anchored by seabed-mounted passive sonar arrays deployed at depths approaching 3,000 meters throughout the South China Sea. The system design incorporated active sonar stations, unmanned underwater vehicles for mobile patrol, and surface vessels equipped with towed arrays similar to SURTASS. Project costs approached 2 billion yuan, approximately $300 million, substantial investment even for a defense budget measured in hundreds of billions annually. Yet the program timeline extending through 2025 revealed implicit acknowledgement that closing the acoustic gap with American capabilities would require a decade of intensive effort even with unlimited funding. The technical challenges extended beyond hardware acquisition into operational domains, where China lacked the institutional experience that American forces had accumulated across 70 years of continuous submarine operations. Sonar operators required training measured in years to distinguish biological sources from mechanical signatures, to recognize the subtle frequency shifts that revealed target aspect changes, to maintain concentration during hours of monitoring where target contacts might occur once per day or less frequently. The U.S. Navy had been training ASW specialists since submarines became viable military threats during World War I, refining techniques across multiple generations of technology, accumulating knowledge that resided not just in technical manuals but in the collective experience of communities of practice spanning decades. China's submarine force dated to the 1970s, with credible ASW capabilities emerging only in the 1990s. The experience deficit could not be eliminated through accelerated training programs or technology acquisition. Even as Chinese engineers deployed prototype sensors and conducted trials of autonomous underwater vehicles equipped with passive sonar arrays, American submarine technology continued advancing along trajectories that maintained or expanded acoustic advantages. The Virginia-class Block V variant, with lead ship New Jersey scheduled for commissioning in 2025, incorporated the Virginia Payload Module Standard, while adding acoustic improvements that Navy officials described in unclassified testimony as advancing stealth characteristics beyond Block III standards. Specific technical details remained classified, but open-source reporting indicated modifications to propulsor design, additional acoustic isolation for machinery systems, and hull coating improvements that further reduced active sonar return signatures. Each incremental improvement in Virginia-class acoustic stealth required corresponding improvements in Chinese sensor sensitivity and processing capabilities merely to maintain existing detection probabilities, creating a competition where China perpetually lagged by intervals measured in years or decades. The fundamental physics of underwater acoustics imposed constraints that no amount of investment could fully overcome. Sound propagation in seawater followed physical laws governing absorption, scattering, and refraction that determined maximum detection ranges for any given combination of source level, ambient noise, and target strength. American submarines already operated at acoustic levels approaching the theoretical minimum achievable with mechanical propulsion systems. Further reductions would require revolutionary technologies like magneto-hydrodynamic drives that remained confined to research laboratories without clear paths to operational implementation. Chinese submarines, starting from acoustic baselines 20 to 30 decibels higher than American boats, faced the challenge of implementing multiple generations of noise reduction technology simultaneously, while American designs continued incrementally improving. The operational evidence of persistent American acoustic superiority continued accumulating through events that punctuated the ongoing competition for undersea dominance. In October 2021, reports emerged that a U.S. Navy submarine had struck an uncharted seamount while conducting operations in the South China Sea, an incident that resulted in injuries to crew members and damage requiring the boat to surface and transit to Guam for repairs. Chinese state media celebrated the incident as evidence that American submarines were not invulnerable, that their operations in waters China claimed carried risks that had now manifested in a collision that could have resulted in catastrophic hull breach and loss of the boat. Yet the reporting glossed over the more significant revelation embedded in the incident. A U.S. Navy submarine had been operating submerged in the South China Sea, conducting a mission that remained classified even after the collision forced acknowledgement of the boat's presence, and Chinese ASW forces had not detected its presence prior to the accident. The submarine had transited into the area undetected, conducted its mission undetected, and would have completed its patrol and departed undetected had an underwater navigation hazard not intervened. Chinese sonar operators monitoring the incident location detected the submarine only after the collision generated transient acoustics, dramatically exceeding any signature the boat produced during normal operations. The incident confirmed rather than refuted American acoustic superiority, demonstrating that even an accident producing abnormal noise levels resulted in detection only at close ranges, and that routine submarine operations remained effectively invisible to Chinese sensors throughout the engagement area. The broader strategic reality that emerged from 2 decades of undersea competition in the South China Sea validated assessments that acoustic superiority would determine undersea domain control more decisively than platform numbers or geographic proximity. China operated approximately 60 submarines by 2022, a force that exceeded U.S. Pacific Fleet submarine strength and represented the second-largest submarine fleet globally. Yet quantity provided no offset to quality when acoustic signatures differed by factors of 10 or more. A Virginia-class submarine conducting covert operations in waters adjacent to Chinese naval bases faced detection probabilities measured in single-digit percentages, even when Chinese ASW forces actively searched. Chinese submarines operating in the same waters confronted detection probabilities approaching certainty once American sensors achieved initial localization. This disparity transformed submarine operations from symmetrical competition, where both sides faced comparable risks, into an asymmetric environment, where American boats operated with freedom of action, while Chinese submarines remained confined to defensive positions in areas where friendly forces provided sensor coverage and potential protection. The strategic implications extended to every scenario involving potential conflict in the Western Pacific. Chinese war plans that depended on submarine interdiction of American reinforcement convoys faced the reality that Chinese boats would be detected, localized, and engaged before achieving firing positions on their targets. American operational plans that incorporated submarine launch strikes against Chinese facilities proceeded with confidence that strike platforms would remain undetected through weapons release and probably through post-strike egress. The technological trajectory, visible in ongoing submarine development programs, suggested that acoustic asymmetry favoring the United States would persist through at least the next decade regardless of Chinese investments in sensor networks or submarine quieting. The SSN-X program, conceived as the replacement for Virginia-class production beginning in the late 2030s, aimed to combine Seawolf-class speed and payload capacity with Virginia-class sensor capabilities and acoustic stealth characteristics matching or exceeding Columbia-class ballistic missile submarines. Columbia-class acoustic signatures, while remaining classified, were described in congressional testimony as representing generational improvement over existing platforms, language that indicated noise levels approaching or reaching the acoustic background of ocean ambient sound. A submarine operating at acoustic levels indistinguishable from environmental noise would be undetectable by passive sonar regardless of sensor sensitivity or array aperture, effectively achieving acoustic invisibility through physics rather than stealth geometry. The implications for Chinese ASW efforts were stark. Every passive sonar array, every hydrophone network, every towed array system that Chinese engineers deployed operated on the assumption that target submarines would generate acoustic signatures exceeding ambient ocean noise by margins sufficient to permit detection through signal processing and array gain. If American submarines achieved acoustic signatures matching ambient noise levels, passive detection would become impossible without visual confirmation or active sonar prosecution. Active sonar revealed the position of the transmitting platform and required power levels that created environmental concerns and operational limitations, making it unsuitable for persistent surveillance operations. The Chinese underwater sensor network, regardless of how many hydrophones engineers installed or how sophisticated the signal processing algorithms became, would detect nothing if American submarines generated no acoustic signature distinguishable from the ocean environment. The moment when Chinese strategic planners fully internalized the implications of American acoustic superiority remained classified in assessments that have not been publicly disclosed, but evidence suggests that recognition drove policy decisions that shaped regional security dynamics through the first quarter of the 21st century. China's reluctance to escalate maritime confrontations beyond Coast Guard and maritime militia operations, the careful constraints that characterized PLA Navy responses during freedom of navigation operations, the absence of aggressive submarine patrols in areas where encounters with American vessels might occur all reflected institutional understanding that undersea domain control belonged entirely to the United States Navy, and that no near-term technological developments would alter this reality. The South China Sea, despite China's construction of military facilities on artificial islands and deployment of surface forces throughout disputed waters, remained transparent to American intelligence collection and accessible to American submarines conducting operations that Chinese forces could neither detect nor prevent. This operational reality imposed strategic constraints on Chinese options during crises that persisted despite the visible expansion of Chinese naval capabilities across 2 decades of sustained investment. The submarines that China could not detect determined strategic outcomes more decisively than the surface ships that satellite imagery could count. Join us here at Classified Warfare as we continue uncovering the technological innovations and operational capabilities that determined maritime dominance beneath the waves, where silence constituted the ultimate weapon and acoustic superiority decided the outcome before surface forces ever engaged. The competition for undersea control in the South China Sea demonstrates how technological advantage concentrated in a single domain can negate adversary investments across multiple others, revealing that the most decisive battles are often those where detection never occurs and where dominance manifests not through visible force, but through capabilities that remain hidden in the depths, until the moment deterrence must become action.